I believe that every human being with a physically normal brain can learn a great deal and can be surprisingly intellectual. I believe that what we badly need is a social approval of learning and social rewards for learning. Isaac Asimov. All right. Welcome to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. If you're tuning in live, then I want to especially thank you for giving me your time so early. So, this morning, I'm going to discuss the issue. I'm going to break down the issue over in Yemen. As you may know, President Biden ordered some strikes over in Yemen. So, the question is like, what's going on there? Why are people debating the War Powers Resolution, or you may know it as the War Powers Act? And I'm going to try my best to give you a very brief, but a concise, but as much as we can as a complete understanding of what's going on in less than an hour. Now, the reality is there's a whole lot of information out there, and it could easily take you, a couple of hours to review it in full. But I think I was able to distill it down. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I found a video, and everything that I have today, as usual, will be in the show notes. But I found a video from Caspian Report, and the video itself is about 15 minutes. I was able to cut it down so that we could watch it here in about 5 minutes. So I'm going to play that video. I may or may not stop as we're going along watching this video. This is going to kind of give us an overview of what is even happening in Yemen in the first place over in this part of the world that's related to the strikes that President Biden ordered. And then got all of us up in a roar, arguing about whether or not the War Powers Act was whether or not the president was using his constitutional authority or not, or whether he was usurping constitutional requirements upon him. So let's go ahead and kick it off, and we'll just play this video, and we'll see what's going on, and then we can talk about the bills and all the stuff.
Conflict is the crucible of change. Since early December, Houthi rebels have strangled one of the most strategic ocean waterways for international trade. Vessels have been boarded, missiles have been fired, and drones have been deployed. Simultaneously, the navies of the world, including the US Navy, have been slow to react. As a result, global maritime trade has been severely disrupted. The world's largest container shipping companies have stopped shipments through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. The US Navy has moved a carrier strike group from the Persian Gulf into the Gulf of Aden. At the same time, a new 10-country naval task force is being set up to protect shipping in the region, but the Americans don't want to get tied up in the Yemeni proxy conflict. Still worse, the neighboring powers have inconsistent interests. Egypt's economy is in pain, Iran is looking for new leverage, Saudi Arabia has a ceasefire with the Houthis, China is gloating to see the US Navy stretched thinly, and the UAE wants to escalate things, but doesn't want to get its hands dirty.
All right, so I'm going to pause it right there just to kind of look here. And so we've already got this like huge like brewing conflict with everybody, like not everybody, but like, a lot of these countries in the area, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Yemen, UAE, the US, who's not in that particular area, but we are in the tiny little ships. And so what we've got is there's this huge conflict, and everybody kind of has their own thing going on. And so we've all got different interest in the area. And then, of course, we still like these are just the national interest. We haven't even gotten to the issue of trade. So let's continue.
Broadly speaking, the Red Sea is a confluence of geography, economics, technology, and geopolitics. The Houthis have now declared American ships as targets and are looking to use force, but they're poking the hornet's nest. For the global economy to prosper, trade must go uninterrupted. Around 80% of international trade goes by sea, and ships must reach their ports as expeditiously and as cost-effectively as possible. However, ships are most vulnerable when passing through narrow passages. The Red Sea is one such passage. It is defined by two choke points: the Suez Canal to the north and the Bab al-Mandab Strait to the south. About 12% of global trade goes by this route, accounting for about 20% of international container traffic. Also noteworthy, roughly 10% of the world's maritime oil and 8% of liquefied natural gas is shipped through the same route. However, Houthi rebels from Yemen have put a stop to that by using missiles, drones, and fast attack ships. At its narrowest point, the Bab al-Mandab Strait is about 29 kilometers wide, and that is where the raids have taken place. So far, the Houthis have directly targeted at least 12 commercial vessels transiting the region, firing over 100 drones and missiles at ships from more than a dozen countries. In response to the maritime blockade, 4 of the world's 5 largest container shipping companies have suspended shipping through the Red Sea. These include Denmark's Maersk, France's CMA CGM, Germany's Hapag Lloyd, and Switzerland's MSC. Together, these companies account for more than 50% of global container shipping capacity. Multinational British Petroleum is stopping shipments through the Red Sea as well. If other energy firms join the call, oil and gas supplies could be in severe trouble. Container ships making runs between Europe and Asia are getting reacquainted with the Cape of Good Hope, which had been largely obsolete since the opening of the Suez Canal more than 150 years ago. However, this detour adds about 7,400 kilometers and up to 14 days of travel time to the journey, costing millions of dollars in extra fuel and other insurance and auxiliary costs. Since the start of the crisis, the U.S. Navy has moved the Dwight D. Eisenhower-led aircraft carrier and its task force into the Gulf of Aden. Now, Washington is mustering an international armada to reassure shipping companies and deter the Houthi blockade.
Okay, so let's pause it there for just a moment, just to kind of point something out very quickly. At least according to this video, and from what I could determine online through some research, it does appear that the U.S. first moved in our ships and then started seeking out getting a multinational cooperation going on. So I think it's very important for us to know. We'll talk about that in just a moment.
But universal commitment is brittle. Britain has agreed to deploy ships, but France, Italy, and Spain have rejected the operation.
Now, I find this kind of interesting because a moment ago he pointed out that one of the 4 world's largest shipping companies, and I don't remember the name, but what it was a French company. He said they were from France, and so I find it kind of interesting that France doesn't appear to want to be part of this coalition, even though one of the one of the largest companies appears to be from France. Kind of interesting.
Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates are also notably absent. China, which has warships in its base in Djibouti, is not part of the coalition either. What is left is not much of a task force. Each party has its own motives for rejecting the US-led operation. One of the reasons is the costs. Western naval forces use highly expensive equipment to fend off cheap drones. The French recently fired an Aster 15 surface-to-air missile worth more than $1 million to shoot down a Shahed-type drone costing barely $20,000. That is not a sustainable way of combat. When you employ $1 million weapon to kill a budget drone, it's really the budget drone that makes the kill. In sum, Western navies were not designed to repel the type of threat posed by the Houthis. Then again, a drone damaging a commercial ship would cost just as much as $1 million weapon. So there are considerations from all angles, and that's what makes this battle space so complicated.
All right. So I hope that gave you a good overview of what's going on. There's obviously a whole lot more information. The original video that I pulled that from and kind of cut it up a little bit was probably about, I think it was like 19 minutes. It might have been 15. I don't remember exactly, but it's somewhere in the 15 to 19-minute range. And there's a whole bunch of other videos as well that discuss, exactly what's going on. So in relation to this, what happened was the Biden administration launched some attacks over in the Yemeni area, over in Yemen, attacking some Houthi targets, some military targets from the Houthi rebels, and so then that started this debate. Like, okay, well, was he permitted to do that? Did he violate the War Powers Resolution? And so a lot of people said yes, and a lot of people said no, so on and so forth. Here's what I posted up on Twitter, and we'll bring that up real quickly here. So I said, answers that warmongers don't want you to know. So you kind of got an idea of where I'm already going with this. Did Houthis fire on American ships get names, dates, times, and sit reps situation reports? Are these events creating a national emergency? And then why did the U.S. wait 3 months to respond? And why didn't President of the United States seek congressional approval in that 3 months? I find that these questions are very important in understanding whether or not the president has utilized his power properly. And the reason is because, well, I tell you what, let's go to my other media clip here, and this will talk about the War Powers Act. This is also about a 4 or 5 minute video. And this comes from the very right wing history channel. So I hope that this is considered an acceptable video. I try to find videos and media and resources or sources that are not explicitly like super left or super right per se, or at least are going to be, not questioned. So this is going to go over the War Powers Act, and then we can get back to these questions, and then we can talk a little bit further about what's going on. And I'm actually going to bring up the War Powers Act and some other documents. And so we're going to go through this, and we're going to kind of get a sense, and hopefully by the end of the show, you'll understand why I think that the president was in violation of the Constitution. So let's play this next video here.
The War Powers Resolution. The year was 1973. Richard Nixon was president of the United States, and U.S. troops had been fighting in Vietnam for nearly 18 years, all without an official declaration of war. This prompted Congress to pass the War Powers Resolution of 1973, preventing any future president from involving the U.S. in an undeclared war. Congress had traditionally declared war or authorized the president to use military force against enemies beyond its borders, a power granted exclusively to them by Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, these were all declared by Congress. But after World War II, things got a bit fuzzy. Some presidents started taking military liberties with their role as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, a power also granted by the Constitution. In 1950, President Harry Truman sent U.S. troops to help defend South Korea against North Korean invaders. He called it a police action, so technically it wasn't a war. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy sent supplies and military advisors to South Vietnam. Less than a year later, U.S. troops were fighting in the Vietnam War, including in the Gulf of Tonkin, all without that official declaration. And then in 1969, President Richard Nixon began bombing Cambodia in secret, hiding missions from both Congress and the American people. It took more than a year for this information to leak to the public, and it wasn't until 1973 that Congress ordered an immediate end to the bombing raids. But at this point, Congress realized more needed to be done to check the power of the president when it came to war.
Okay. So at this point, I know I have friends that are like, look, the war powers resolution, I'm totally against it. And part of it may be, depending on who you're talking to, and can be that the Congress in 1973 decided to impose more restrictions on the president's power. Now, that is a very important point to consider. That what they were trying to do is they wanted to put more checks. They wanted to limit the president. This is very, very important when people are making these arguments, because a lot of people have argued, and I've watched people come out and say, they've come out and said, well, the war powers resolution gives the president this, power to do this. It doesn't give him anything. It actually puts restrictions on the president, and it is an additional limitation on him. So whatever the president, or him or her, but whatever the president was able to do prior to 1973, in theory, at least that was the purpose, the War Powers Resolution went to restrict and limit, so that the president could not engage in secret wars or say, okay, well, this is not a war, this is a police action. And since it's a police action, it's within my purview. And this is some of the same problems that we see in other elements of government. For instance, the 10th Amendment. A lot of people like to say, well, this is what's the I'm drawing a blank on the phrase at the moment, so I apologize. But a lot of people will make an argument that the Commerce Clause, extends to this and to that and to this and to that, and they basically are doing the same thing when they say, "Well, this is a police action over here; it's not war." Then you'll see a lot of people make the argument, "Well, the federal government needs to be involved in this because it is it's commerce, and so we need to regulate commerce and we need to deal with this." So this is a very consistent issue with the government, where people play very loose with language. And so you had the president already playing loose, at least according to Congress. Then Congress goes and passes this resolution, and then now we see that people are still kind of playing loose with language. So there's always this looseness, right? People are trying to extend the scope of their power. So let's continue on.
So, on November 7th, 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution. The idea was to ensure that Congress and the president agreed on war actions before committing troops into hostile situations. There are a few key parts to the War Powers Resolution. First, the president must consult and report to Congress before sending troops overseas, though he or she can initiate sending troops in the case of an attack. Second, if the president initiates a hostile action, it can only last for 60 days plus a 30-day withdrawal period.
Okay, so notice what he just said. He said, if the president initiates an action, it can only last 60 days plus 30-day withdrawal. So what it's saying is, okay, here it's a conditional. If you do this, you have a limit. So again, when people try to suggest that the War Powers Resolution gives the president this authority, it doesn't actually give him any authority whatsoever, any more than what he had. It actually gives him limitations on that authority.
Then Congress has to vote on whether it can continue, unless Congress can't meet because of an attack on the U.S. mainland. And finally, if forces have been deployed that aren't acting on a declaration of war, the president must remove them at direction of Congress.
So again, he must remove them at the direction of Congress. So Congress is still asserting its authority in this particular area. Now, this is regardless of whether you agree or disagree with the War Powers Resolution. We just want to make sure that we understand exactly what it is doing, because, well, how else can we determine whether or not we agree with the president's actions in Yemen? All right. And so to quickly recap for anybody that may be listening to the show, on the screen, it's given a quick recap. And it says, number one, president consults Congress before sending troops overseas. Number two, hostile action can only last 60 days. Number three, if no declaration of war, Congress can remove troops.
Although the War Powers Resolution had broad bipartisan support, it didn't pass without a fight. After they voted to pass the bill, President Nixon vetoed it. Nixon argued that it violated the constitutional powers of the president.
So in a moment, I'm actually going to pull up his veto, and we're gonna read a few snippets from the veto because I think it's very, very important when we're having the conversation about the War Powers Resolution.
That the only way to limit the president's role as commander-in-chief would be to amend the Constitution itself. But Congress voted again and overrode the veto. The War Powers Resolution became law. Despite the resolution, presidents and Congress have still been at odds when it comes to military action. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan deployed several U.S. military advisors to El Salvador.
Okay, so we see that word again, or not that specific word, but we see this wording again. Advisors. We're sending advisors here. We're not sending the military. We're sending advisors.
Without reporting to Congress. Some members of Congress filed a federal lawsuit, but the court dismissed the case. In the 90s, President Bill Clinton sent forces to Kosovo, and troops remained there for more than the 60-day limit. This resulted in another lawsuit from members of Congress, but once more, the federal court refused to intervene. So while the War Powers Resolution has limited the president's ability to send troops overseas, the branches of government still wrestle over their power, which is exactly what the nation's founders intended.
All right. So great video there. I thought I'd clipped out that end, but that's okay. So ultimately, what we have is we have a situation where the Congress did not like how the president was exercising his authority. And so they went to limit his authority. So when a lot of people suggest to you that, again, the president is, he was given this authority. He wasn't given any authority. And so it's clear that this person has not read the War Powers Resolution, nor are they familiar with the history of it. Now, what I really find interesting is, I was watching that video and, I was like, oh yeah, Nixon vetoed it. And I didn't really think much of it. And then after some conversation with people online, I was like, I'm curious what the president at the time thought. And the reason a lot of people kind of have this presentation of what the War Powers Resolution is based on their reading today. And then I look and I say, well, what did the people of the day think of it? And I thought, well, since the president vetoed it, let's go see what he said in that veto. So, and I think this is extremely important in understanding, um, the purpose of this resolution. So let's pull that up real quick. Actually, you know what? I take it back. Let's look at the War Power Resolution Act first. So let's see, bring that up on screen there. And then, so public law 93-148. So this is again, November 7th, 1973. This is the actual document, been scanned in. We're not going to read through the whole thing. It's about 6 pages, but I do want to read a couple snippets here. So at the very beginning, under purpose and policy, it says, and this is section 2 here. So section 1 just says this joint resolution may be cited as the War Powers Resolution. And then it goes on to say, it is the purpose of this joint resolution to fulfill the intent of the framers of the Constitution of the United States and ensure that the collective judgment of both the Congress and the president will apply to the introduction of the United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances, and to the continued use of forces in hostilities or in such situations. So clearly the issue in Yemen does qualify for this because he's introducing United States Armed Forces into hostilities, and then further into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is indicated. So in other words, by moving troops into the area in the first place, that puts our troops in a situation where hostilities could happen at any time, because you've got the Houthi rebels who are, attacking different ships and, sending out drones and so on and so forth. And so they're doing all these things, and then we have moved our troops in there. Then on top of that, the president actually ordered strikes, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So continuing on here, it says the constitutional powers of the president as commander in chief to introduce United States armed forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by circumstances are exercised only pursuant to, and then it's got three conditions. So here are the conditions under which the president may introduce U.S. armed forces into hostilities or situations where a hostility is imminent. Number one, a declaration of war. Okay, so they kept that on the table. Number two, specific statutory authorization. In other words, hey, you can move troops here into this particular situation for this reason, right? Number three, a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. Rather, this is where the gentleman a moment ago was talking about, like, if there's a national emergency, if Congress can't meet. So if our troops are somewhere, if somebody attacks one of our bases and we determine that we know who they are and we need to make a response, the president is at liberty to make some moves, if you will, until such time that Congress has an opportunity to meet and then determine, okay, what's going on, what's the extent of the hostile situation, what do we need to do, what's our, how long should our response be, what should the level of response be, all those kind of things. So they can meet and they can make these determinations. And I think that's all we wanted to read out of this document. I don't think I highlighted anything else. No, but you can see that it's quite a long document, and well, for what I just read, it seems like it's a bit of a long document. It's only actually 6 pages, relatively easy read. I will have a link to it in the show notes. The link will go to a PDF document so that you can read it yourself. And it does go into the specifics, as far as like the 60 days and the 30 days and so on and so forth. So, but now you have a general idea of exactly what the War Powers Resolution has said. Again, declaration of war, specific statutory authorization, or a national emergency based on an attack of the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. All right. So now let's move on to what President Nixon said, because I think this is what Nixon said. I thought was the absolutely most useful part of having this whole entire conversation, this whole entire debate that we're having right now. So let me pull that up on the screen. All right. So this is President Nixon's veto to Congress, which they overrode, by the way. So here's what he said. And again, I'm not going to read the whole thing. This is only 4 pages, but you can. I'll have a link to it in the show notes. All right. So down here, he says to the House of Representatives. I'm going to read a little bit section. In this one, I've highlighted the most important part, but I'm going to read a little bit more. I hereby return without my approval House Joint Resolution 542, the War Powers Resolution. While I am in accord with the desire of the Congress to assert its proper role in the conduct of our foreign affairs, this is the part you need to pay attention to. The restrictions which this resolution would impose upon the authority of the president are both unconstitutional and dangerous to the best interest of our nation. So, right off the bat, at the very beginning, President Nixon points out that in his belief, their resolution was unconstitutional and it was dangerous. So he's already stating like, hey, look, you are going to be limiting, right? He's already kind of setting the stage for telling Congress that you're imposing a limitation. So when people try to suggest that the War Powers Resolution gives the president some sort of authority, it does not, right? We've already see that right out the gate. President Nixon saw otherwise. So let's continue on. You can look this up and read more in depth. The founding fathers understood the impossibility of foreseeing every contingency that might arise in this complex area. They acknowledged the need for flexibility in responding to changing circumstances. They recognized that foreign policy decisions must be made through close cooperation between the two branches and, here it goes again, not through rigidly codified procedures. So again, he's calling what they're doing a rigid codified procedure. In other words, you are you are forcing my hand to be engaging in all this bureaucracy. I got to do all these things in order to use my authority. Now, again, we can agree or disagree whether or not the War Powers Resolution was a legitimate resolution, whether or not in itself it was, a lot of legal scholars will, already argue whether or not they believe it was unconstitutional in the first place, and that whether the president was correct in saying that in order to do this, you need to make an amendment to the Constitution. That's a separate argument. We're just simply trying to make sure that we understand what is the current law, right? And the current law turns out is very readable to the average citizen. All right, so going on, he goes clearly unconstitutional under the section clearly unconstitutional. House Joint Resolution 542 would attempt to take away by a mere legislative act authorities which the president has properly exercised under the Constitution for almost 200 years. So he's telling Congress, you're going to be taking away authorities. You're not giving them to me. You're taking them away. You're making it more limited. Now, I want you to think back to the video that we just watched where he was talking about why Congress even decided to pass the resolution. And it was because you had all these actions by presidents that were occurring either in secret or without Congress's knowledge, and they were calling them police actions and all these other different things, right? So you have presidents exercising a specific authority in a way that Congress felt was inappropriate. And so then Congress comes along and they said, okay, well, we need to do something about this. Again, to agree or disagree with their actions. So then we go on. And he said, while I firmly believe that a veto of House Joint Resolution 542 is warranted solely on constitutional grounds, I am also deeply disturbed by the practical consequences of this resolution. Here's a good part. For it would seriously undermine this nation's ability to act decisively and convincingly in times of international crisis. So he's telling Congress, look, you are going to make it difficult for the nation to respond the way that it needs to when there's an international issue. Well, it turns out we're dealing with an international issue right now. And it seems like everybody's on board with this idea that, oh, nope, he's totally fine with President Biden is not in violation of the Constitution or the War Powers Resolution. He was totally within the scope of his authority, which is very interesting because he doesn't seem to have been limited whatsoever. And that's exactly what this resolution does. It limits the president on what they can do. All right, a little bit more reading here, and then we'll be done with this document. If this resolution had been in operation, America's effective response to a variety of challenges in recent years would have been vastly complicated or even made impossible. We may well have been unable to respond in the way we did during the Berlin crisis of 1961, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the Congo Rescue Mission of 1964, and the Jordanian Crisis of 1970, to mention just a few examples. In addition, our recent actions to bring about a peaceful settlement of the hostilities in the Middle East would have been seriously impaired if this resolution had been enforced. So again, the president of the United States, who vetoed the War Powers Resolution, lays out his argument why it is that the War Powers Resolution is too restrictive. So when people try to say like, oh, the president is, is given this power, or their argument is basically along that line, then you need to step back and say, okay, what limitations would the president have had in a situation like this? Or back to my point, my Twitter post where I said, all right, these are answers that the warmongers don't want you to know. Because I believe that if you answer them and you answer them accurately, then you're going to find that the president was actually in violation of the War Powers Resolution. And we can actually have an argument later about whether or not he was in violation of the US Constitution. But right now we're focusing on the War Powers Resolution. So, did Houthis fire on American ships? Get names, dates, times, and sit reps. Now, why do we need all of that information? Again, as I pointed out in the War Powers Resolution, it says that the third criteria for the president introducing U.S. armed forces into hostilities was, quote, a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories, or possessions, or its armed forces. So we need to know what is the nature of the event that caused the president to say, we need to go and strike at Yemen. We need names of ships, we need dates, times, and sit reps. Now, in response to this post, somebody did post a link to they posted a link to a Reuters article, and that one was titled "Houthi attacks on shipping in Red Sea persist. U.S. and allies strike back." So let me pull that up on the screen so that we can take a look at that really quickly, and then we can get a sense of, okay, what kind of attacks were occurring. So let me get that up on the screen here. There we are, and make it a little bit bigger. So here's that article. And again, this will be in the show notes as well. The United States and Britain carried out strikes from the air and sea against Houthi military targets in Yemen in response to the movement's attacks on ships. They just say ships in general in the Red Sea. The Houthis have been targeting vessels in the southern Red Sea and the Bab al Mandab. I can't say that fast enough. Bab al Mandab Strait and attacks the Iran-aligned group says aim to support the Palestinians as Israel and Hamas wage war. So the Houthis right now, their argument is, hey, we are taking aim at Israel because Israel and Hamas are at war. We're siding with the Palestinians, and to some extent, I assume Hamas as well. Now, what are the recent Houthi attacks and international responses? So the way this article presents them, they present them kind of backwards. They do it like the most recent, and then they go forward. So I found a Wikipedia article that, and that article is titled, what's the Houthi involvement in the Israel Hamas war, and so it goes down and it orders them chronologically from the beginning, not from the end. And so one of the first things that happened was on October 19th, 2023. U.S. officials said that the United States Navy destroyer USS Carney shot down 3 land attack cruise missiles and several drones heading toward Israel launched by the Houthis in Yemen. Okay. So the Houthis were launching attacks at Israel and the U.S. intercepted them. Okay. So that is the first event in this particular conflict that has occurred, that the U.S. Navy intervened in between a hostility between 2 other countries. So this is one of the reasons why I say that the president was not at liberty to utilize his authority in the way he did, is because this would have been an immediate attack, an immediate emergency for Israel, but we are not Israel. We are the United States. All right, so looking at this, the most recent one was Houthis fired an anti-ship ballistic missile into international shipping lanes in the Gulf of Aden, but the attack did not cause injuries nor damage, the U.S. military said. It was the 27th such Houthi attack since November 19th, the U.S. said. Okay, so this was an attack by sending ballistic missiles into the shipping lanes. Now, remember in a video earlier, he said that the shipping lane was only like, trying to remember what he said in kilometers, but I think in miles, it was like 18 miles wide at its most narrow. So it's not very wide. And I believe that gives you, I think that presents for shipping. I think I read it was like 2 shipping lanes, one going in each direction. So they sent missiles in there, but there were no injuries and there was no damage. So again, I'm back to the issue of national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories, or possessions, or armed forces. So there was not an attack. And then, I mean, on the U.S., right? They sent ballistic missiles into shipping lanes. Not appropriate, right? Beyond not appropriate. That in itself is a hostile action. However, the question is, does the president have the authority to engage in hostile actions with the U.S. armed forces or even move them into place where they could be? So again, when I read the Reuters article, it points out that the most recent was ballistic missiles sent into shipping lanes with the intent to cause injury and death, I presume. I presume that they didn't just do it just as a show of force, but they actually were trying to, and for whatever reason, they either missed or what have you. Um, but there were no injuries and there was no damage. So that was the most recent one prior to our strikes in Yemen. Okay. So again, we're not creating an emergency for the United States. It is a hostile action. But the question is it an emergency where the president doesn't have time to wait for Congress? Then, if we go to my Wikipedia article, which I'll pull that up on the screen for you, and that's right here. And it says, and again, in 19 on the 19th of October, 2023, U.S. officials said the United States Navy destroyer USS Carney shot down 3 land attack cruise missiles and several drones heading toward Israel, launched by Houthis in Yemen. Yeah, Yemen. And again, this is the U.S. taking part in hostile actions with at the president's discretion, without congressional approval. This is the core of my issue. Now, should we be involving ourselves? Well, according to the video, the Houthi rebels are creating quite an issue because trade could be severely disrupted for the entire planet. And it gave the percentages like some 20% of trade was going through the Red Sea. And you had those 2 choke points, the one where what was it called again? Lost the name on it. Where'd it go? The Bab al Mandab Strait, right, which is over where the Houthi rebels are over in Yemen, over in the northern part of Yemen. So you have this conflict going on. But the question is the US in a situation where this is an emergency and the US absolutely must act? So I argue they weren't, and that the president should have simply went to Congress and said, "Look, I need some authority in order to maybe defend Israel," right? Like, I'm not making a defense. I'm not suggesting that's what we should do. What I'm saying is this is what the president should have done. He should have went and said, "Look, the Houthi rebels, they're trying to attack Israel, and they're also trying to attack ships that are headed toward Israel. So what we need to do is we need to defend them." That's what he should have said. He should have went to Congress and gotten that approval. Then further, he should have also said, "I would like to move troops into the area to escort or to help defend ships from other nations that are traveling through this area, because there's a lot of ships and there's a lot on the line." That's really the bulk of my argument. Now, should we get involved in this? I tend to think not. I tend to think that when we are involved, we incentivize people, other nations, to engage in further responses. And so I think that we have to be very careful about what involvement we get in, because as we saw in the video, this could get very dicey very quickly. It looks like China is really excited to see our ships spread thin. Iran, wants their certain level of control, but they're trying to do it in a way that doesn't cause them problems. So it appears to me that they're using the Houthi rebels, and so it's a very messy situation that could quickly spiral out of control. So then the question is, with our involvement, because um, the we have the resources to a degree to fend off some of these attacks. But the question is, how long do we have these resources? Because again, as he pointed out in that video, it was like what, a $1 million French missile that took out a $20,000 drone, right? And so clearly the drone won. The drone was able to take out $1 million, and so even if the drone had attacked a ship, it could have been $1 million or more, depending on what ship was attacked and the extent of the damages and the casualties and so forth. So again, this is a very this is this because this situation has the potential to spiral out of control, because you've got nations that have chosen to not be part of this task force that the president is trying to put together. I believe that he has absolutely exceeded his authority, and that he absolutely needed to go to Congress, and Congress can have this debate and they can determine what, if any, actions the US partakes in. Now, again, let's go back to, let me see if I can pull it back up on the screen here. Where do we go here? And we're going to pull up the War Powers Act, and we're going to take a look at that one more time, because I think it's very important that we understand that there were multiple situations where the president could get proper approval. Because again, he Congress can declare a war, which I think would be silly, like beyond silly. This is not a wartime situation. This is not one nation, fighting, coming at us and saying, "Hey, we're going to attack you and send over, number of troops and so on and so forth." So this is not a war. This is not a typical war where a declaration of war against another country needs to be put forward. However, number two might apply a specific statutory authorization. Congress might look at the information and say, you know what? It turns out that this is very important, not only to us, but to Europe and to everybody else. We're all allies, and we are going to authorize this limited amount of defense for the ships going through there. And so Mr. President, you're allowed to do this and this and this, and then you can do it for this long, and we need this information back, so on and so forth. But I don't believe that it qualifies for number three, which was a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories, or possessions, or its armed forces. Now, some people have argued and said, well, they sent over drones to our ships. But again, the president moved ships over there on purpose, specifically related to the Houthi attacks that they were making in the Red Sea, in the Gulf there. So we moved our ships there, which again, if you look at what this says, the constitutional powers of the president as commander in chief to introduce U.S. armed forces into hostilities. Okay, so he introduced our troops into a hostile situation. Oh, or you could probably more accurately read it by the next portion where it says, or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances. In other words, you put troops in harm's way. That's what he did. And so it is telling the president here, there are three situations where you can engage in hostilities or put troops in harm's way. And again, it's if we declare war, if we give you a statutory authorization that's very specific to the situation, or if there's an emergency where you cannot wait. Now, the question is, if on October of 2023, where we shot down some drones and some missiles that were heading toward Israel, you might argue and say, well, that was an emergency situation. Okay, fine. That was in October of 2023. That is 3 months ago. Why hasn't the president went and spoke with Congress and said, I would like formal authority? The reason is because, well, two reasons. Number one, president just doing what he thinks is the right thing to do based on whatever. And, so I think that's a really poor way to put it. But ultimately, if you remember from the video, the reason that presidents are doing this, they're doing basically what they believe is in the national interest. But the reason that they keep doing this, because remember, the video pointed out a few moments ago that even after passage, presidents were still playing loose, and the Congress would go and they would try to file a lawsuit against the president, and the Supreme Court would refuse to hear it. But Congress is not asserting any kind of authority whatsoever. So Congress in 1973, they said, all right, here's this resolution, and here are the limitations upon the president. And the president says, yeah, whatever. And continues to do what presidents do, which is to serve national interest, based on their advisors and what they believe is the right thing to do, totally disregarding Congress. Well, if Congress isn't going to exert its authority, then the War Powers Resolution is kind of pointless in the first place. But ultimately, again, the whole point here, the whole point of this conversation today was simply, let me get back to my screen there. So the whole point was simply to review and say, was the president authorized by the War Powers Resolution to do what he did? I do not believe that in attacking military targets in Yemen, he was within the scope of his authority. And the reason is because if you go back and you look, and you can look at, like, I'll post the link to the Reuters article, and you can look at some of the events. there doesn't appear to be any significant casualties or damages reported. A lot of these things, a lot of these drones, a lot of these missiles have been intercepted, right? So we don't have a hostility that's going on that is causing massive death and destruction. We have attempts at hostilities, and the U.S. is already making responses by defending other ships and in some cases defending itself. I think there was a particular event relatively recently where they in fact, let me look at that. I'm pretty sure I still have that up. Let me take a look real quick here. So where was it? Yes. So January 9th, US and British naval forces shot down 21 Houthi drone and missiles. Um, President Biden said they had directly targeted American ships. The Houthis said it was in part retaliation for the New Year's Eve incident when US helicopters sank 3 Houthi boats, killing fighters who were attempting to board a commercial vessel. So again, I look back and I go to the very, very beginning and I say the president put us in harm's way, put our troops in harm's way, and then authorized the troops to defend themselves and to defend other ships. And he did not get congressional authority at that time, and since then he's still not gotten congressional authority. So then, when we scroll forward here in January, and the president orders a strike in Yemen, then the question is, what is the emergency if it took him 3 months to make that happen? And why aren't people reporting what specific ships are being attacked? If you read through the articles, you'll find that a lot of the articles will point out and they'll say ships and they'll say like US ships, but they won't name specific, they don't have specific names and dates and events. And I don't believe that's necessarily on purpose. I think this is just the news media being kind of concise. But I believe that if you dig up this information and you look at it, you're going to find that there is not an emergency that requires the president to act because Congress doesn't have time to get together and make a decision. Now, what I believe is really happening is that the president knows that if he goes to Congress and prior presidents as well, that they're not going to get that approval. So it's easier to simply, how they say it, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than get permission. I believe that's simply what's going on here. The president has determined that he's not going to get permission. So therefore, he'll just get forgiveness later or just disregard it altogether, not worry about it. Because it doesn't appear that Congress is really doing much to exert its authority as they state they have. So, Congress members, you happen to be watching, probably not, but if you are, do your job, right? Exert your authority in the way that you believe is necessary, or stop squawking. Just tell the American people that you're not willing to do your job. But again, at the end of the day, I think the president exceeded the scope of his authority, and is because there was no emergency. There was no emergency that could not wait for Congress. Now, you might have argued that again at the very beginning, but once the president moved our troops into place, that's when he should have started seeking a conversation. Hey, Congress, I moved troops over here because some things were happening. They were sending some missiles. They were sending some drones out. We had to act fast. I didn't have time to wait for you guys to get together. So now that you're together, I need approval for continued action here. He's not doing it. So anyway, that's my show for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it informative and inspiring. Be sure to catch me Monday through Friday, weekdays, 7 a.m. Eastern, for an informed discussion on politics and culture. And then again, Sundays at 7 p.m. with my co-host, Susan Hogarth, as we discuss LP happenings. We look across the vast tyranny of this United States, and we identify what events that Libertarian Party affiliates, state and local level, are conducting, what events they're putting on, so that you can be more informed about what the party is up to. Make sure that you are following my YouTube channel or my Rumble channel. You can find you can find either one of those by going to youtube.libertydad.com or rumble.libertydad.com. Let me know how I'm doing with the show. Leave me a comment. Lastly, I want you to remember, if you are a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. But for now,